Hi, welcome to this module. My name is Sooyoung, and today I'm going to be talking about different types of motions and approaches to those motions. The first type of motion that I'm going to talk about are motions that are framed as this house would, or THW. This motion calls for you to consider whether it is good for us to do the things specified in the motion. These this house would motions almost always has a policy passed by a government. Examples of these motions would be motions such as, this house would legalize all drugs, or this house would introduce a sin tax on all meat products. The first thing to consider when it comes to this house would motions is the question of where this debate occurs. The definition should not be restricted to a specific time or place. So unless the motion specifies otherwise, which I'm going to talk about shortly, it should be assumed to apply to the bulk of the world states. Some motions may presume a certain level of state capacity. So for example, if the motion states, this house would allow citizens to sell their votes to others. This motion will only be relevant in states that are minimally democratic, right? And the opening government may specify this without being accused of place setting. However, teams may not restrict the motion to a particular location. For example, the government team cannot limit this debate just to the United States of America or European capital cities. Note that the proposition's burden to defend the motion does not extend to non-functioning autocracies. So for example, teams would not have to extend this debate to North Korea. However, teams may argue that policies have impacts in non-functioning autocracies, whether that be good or bad. So let's take a look at an example of the motion that states, this house would implement salary caps for professional sports leagues. In this motion, teams should discuss professional sports in India, for example, but teams are not expected to discuss North Korean sporting leagues. The only exception to the above is if the motion specifies a specific place or situation. So for example, if the motion states, in countries with a low birth rate, this house would, or in times of economic crisis, this house would. In these situations, the government's burden should be to talk about the specific circumstances given in the motion. So for example, if the motion about implementing salary caps for professional sports leagues was worded as, this house would implement salary caps for the English Premier League, then it would be valid for the government side or the teams to discuss that about the specific league in that specific context. The second thing that I'm going to talk about is the metric of what good looks like. So remember that in the first part of this video, I said that when it comes to this house would motions, the motion calls for you to consider whether it is good for us to do the things specified in the motion. So the question then becomes, what is good for us? How do we determine that? So it is up for debate what good looks like, and teams will present this as for, the metric of the round. So the questions such as, is an outcome a good or bad thing, would be asked by teams. It is up how we should prioritize or weigh the interest of different groups in the society. So you should not presume that it is primarily about an actor or government that is implicitly or explicitly doing the action. In other words, so going back to the example about sports league, we would not presume that this is entirely about what is best for the national government or the sporting federation, but rather we would consider it from a neutral perspective and its impact on the world as a whole. In other words, teams could discuss about society's enjoyment or welfare of the players, or other stakeholders that they would like to talk about in the debate as long as it's reasonable. The next thing that I'm going to talk about is models. So an opening government team is expected to provide a model in this house would debates. A model is basically a collection of mechanisms which are components explaining how the action in the motion will happen. A model is expected of the opening government team in order to establish how the government bench as a whole will implement the motion. There can be addendums to the model outside the literal meaning of the motion, but they have to be reasonable. Going back to the example of implementing salary caps for professional sports leagues, the motion coming from the opening government can be quite simple. For example, it could just be that sports league will set the cap in consultation with various sports clubs. This will also serve as a legitimate model. It can also be quite thorough. So for example, an opening government team might say, in addition to the model that was just mentioned, it will be pegged to the revenue brought in, and enforcement will be done by fining non-compliers and invalidating contracts that breach this. This will also serve as a legitimate model for the government side. Note that not having a model doesn't mean that the team loses. In other words, just because there's no model, that doesn't mean that opening government or the government bench automatically loses to their opposition. Rather, as a judge, you should simply weigh the strength of the proposition's arguments based on how this motion will likely be implemented. By likely be implemented, you can either consider what the government side or opening government side implicitly gave as descriptions of the action being taken by the teams. In other words, opening government side might not be using the word model, but if there's a setup that it's covering similar aspects within their arguments, then you would be considering that as a judge. Or you could simply infer what a reasonable person would do from the wording of the motion. Note that only the Prime Minister can describe and define the model. The next thing that I'm going to talk about is fiat. So there exists a proposition fiat where we presume that the policy will be passed. But this does not mean that we presume that the policy is effective and beneficial. This means that, for example, going back to the example of salary caps, the opposition side cannot validly win the debate by claiming that a parliament or sporting federation would never pass the laws required to implement salary caps. They could, however, say that popular backlash against it would lead to non-compliance or enforceability in the long run. Along with government or proposition fiat, there also exists an opposition fiat. And an opposition fiat means that the opposition can suggest some changes they would make instead, provided that it uses roughly the same amount of capital or resources, including political capital or willingness to act. So for example, the opposition might say that instead of salary caps, they would mandate that contracts be pegged to the performance on the fields or into sports. This is a roughly comparable proposal in terms of resources required, so this would be a valid proposal from opposition where we can assume that it can be passed. However, if the opposition, for example, says that they would create an international body to measure the performance of all athletes with a central pot of sports earning for all professional sports and redistribute accordingly, this would not be a valid proposal or valid opposition fiat because it does not use roughly the same amount of capital or resources. Fiat will be discussed in more detail in video 4, especially regarding unique cases where opposition fiat is used to establish a counter proposal. So please refer to video 4 for more information on fiat. The second type of motion that I'm going to talk about are motions that are phrased as this house as X. These motions are unique because teams argue from the interests, perspectives, and with the knowledge or ability of the actor in question. So for example, motions of this house as X would be motions such as this house as a parent would teach morality to their underage children through religious context. Or motions such as this house as Iran would resume its nuclear weapons program. If we're debating the motion of this house as Iran would resume its nuclear weapons program, the question is based on Iran's interest, but we would also be considering their capabilities, perspective, access to knowledge of the world, and etc. Although these motions require you to debate from a specific perspective, you can argue for principled or moral arguments as well. It is up for debate as to how important or strong this consideration likely is for the actor that is mentioned in the motion. These motions assume a level of implementation as well. And this is that the actor will be able to do the action in the motion to some extent. However, how they will be able to do so will be up for debate. So for example, Iran might not necessarily succeed at its nuclear weapons program immediately, even though we can assume that it can resume it. Let's look at a different example. For example, if the motion is this house as a parent would send their child to private school, then we can assume that the parent has the resources to send their child to a private school. So how should you evaluate the most important interests of the actor? The approach is similar to evaluating the most important clashes of the debate. So like any clash about the most important issue or issues, you should see if the teams agree explicitly or implicitly about what is important for the actor. So in the case where the teams do not agree about what is important or what is an important interest for the actor, then you should compare the arguments teams have made to see who persuades you that the issue they have raised are indeed the most important to the actor. You might conclude as a judge that one issue or a combination of issues is more important relative to the others. You might also conclude that they are all roughly similar in terms of importance. Finally, if no reasons or arguments are offered, unfortunately, then as a last resort, use the metric of a reasonable person and what they would think is important for the actor in the debate. So one important thing to note in these motions is that the marginal change is the level of generality of X. So in other words, you need to take into consideration the generality of X to determine the impact of marginal change. So what this means is, for example, if the motion is phrased as this house as an individual parent would do X, then in these motions, it would be just one parent doing X, not all the parents. However, in these motions, it would be possible for you to still talk about and show how most other parents already do the same, or most other parents are likely to do the same. Compared to this kind of framing, if the motion is framed as this house as parents would do X, then this motion would be a case where all parents do X under the proposition world. So this is one thing that you should also consider when you come across a motion that is phrased as this house as X. The third type of motion I'm going to talk about are a motion phrased as this house believes that. Examples of these motions would be motions such as this house believes that there is no moral obligation to follow the law, or this house believes that the rise of social media has done more harm than good. So these motions call for you to evaluate whether the statement that comes after the phrase this house believes that is on balance true or not in the world we live in. And this should be evaluated from the perspective of a neutral global party. So for example, if the motion is this house believes that the European Union has done more harm than good, then we would be evaluating whether the statement that European Union has done more harm than good is true or not in the world that we live in. Note that in this motion, you would be evaluating retrospectively because when the motion says has done more harm than good, that asks for you to evaluate from the past until this point of whether the European Union has done more harm than good. In comparison, if the motion was worded such as this house believes that the EU is now obsolete, then this motion would be forward-looking. In other words, starting from the present day and in the near future or the future, is the EU obsolete or not would be the question in the motion. Because the motion has to be evaluated from the perspective of a neutral global party, the debate would not be just about whether the EU has done more harm than good for itself as an entity, or even to some or all of its member nations, but it should be broader than that. It would be from the perspective of a neutral global party. In this House believes that motions, teams are still required to provide definitions and set metrics for the debate. But note that there's no need to provide a mechanism or model. Hence, they do not have to include defending any action to rectify the situation or change the word. And this is probably the point that's different from motions that are phrased as this House would that I talked about earlier in this debate. So in the example of the European Union doing more harm than good motions, you'd be asking questions such as, on balance, has the EU done more harm than good? Or what has the EU done that is relevant in the debate? Or what does harms and good mean, right? Which issues or outcomes are more important, right? Or which definition or metric is required, right? But note that the debate doesn't entail any actions to reform or abolish the European Union. In other words, there's no need to describe how the failures above can be rectified from the government team. The final type of motion that I'm going to talk about are motions that are phrased as, this House believes that X should do an action. So these kinds of motions are similar to this House would debates, in that there's an action or policy at the center of the debate. Okay? You're asked to consider the overall situation for all stakeholders, not necessarily limited to just what is best for actor X. In these motions, the phrase good is still evaluated from the perspective of a neutral observer. So let's take a look at an example of the motion. This House believes that the US should intervene in Syria. In this motion, this will not be just about the US's interest. So this motion will basically be equivalent to this House, and this House being the US, would intervene in Syria. So basically you'd be thinking the debate the same way as if it were phrased like that. Other examples of this House believes that X should motions would look something like, this House believes that campaigners for refugee protection should not use pictures displaying the graphic suffering of refugees as part of their advocacy. So in these motions, even though they are phrased as true or false statements, government teams are encouraged to implement a policy. So take as an example the motion, this House believes that the US should sanction Saudi Arabia. So while it is possible for teams to debate the merits and demerits of sanctions in abstract, the debate would be much clearer if government team presents a policy outlining what sanctions entail, what kinds of sanctions would be implemented, and so on. So the parameters for the propositions policy are exactly like this House would debates as covered in this video earlier on. And similar to policy debates, oppositions may also propose an alternative, and the same rules of opposition fiat would be used to govern these motions. So for example, going back to the example of this House believes that US should intervene in Syria, it is expected for the government to define how they envision the US's intervention with the fiat or assumption that the motion will happen. But again, this does not mean that we assume unreasonably or excessively more than what the motion has provided. So for example, policies or mechanisms such as drone strikes or full-scale invasion or NATO allies would all be legitimate mechanisms that can be provided by government side. However, policies such as multilateral invasion with Russia and China probably would not be legitimate fiats or policies that can be provided by the government team. So now let's look at some motions to review the different kinds of motions that I talked about in this module. So I will be talking about similar ideas and subjects in terms of the motion that are phrased differently. So first of all, let's look at the example of this house would use private military companies in armed conflicts. So in this motion, it would be a motion that refers to the this house would type of motion. And in this motion, the government would have fiat in terms of its policy. In these motions, no actor is specified, so teams would focus on the most reasonable or common set of cases. Next, if the motion is phrased as, this house believes that states should use private military companies in armed conflicts, in this kind of debate, which is this house believes that type of motion that I talked about earlier on in this module, then in this case, government would have fiat to a policy. But because the actor is specified as states, the government fiat or the policy would also be specific to how states will use private military companies. Also, because the motion specified actor as states, teams would not be talking about, for example, the United Nations or international organizations as actors. Next, let's look at motions that is phrased as, this house supports the use of private military companies in armed conflicts. In this case, government would not have fiat regarding a policy. Instead, government teams must describe and substantiate the facts of how private military companies are currently used in armed conflicts and how that is projected to be in the near future. So in this motion, no actor is specified. So teams should focus on the most reasonable or common set of cases. And specifically, because the motion is phrased as support the use of private military companies in armed conflicts, the time frame of the debate probably would be set as in the status quo or near future. So are we going to support this kind of use in the status quo and in the near future would be the consideration of the motion. Finally, if the motion is phrased, for example, as this house regrets the use of private military companies in armed conflicts, again, there would be no government fiat regarding a policy, and government teams must describe and substantiate the facts of how private military companies have previously been used in armed conflicts. So again, in this motion, no actor is specified, so teams should focus on the case where this has actually happened in the past. So this is different from the this house supports motion that I just talked about, because when the motion is phrased as this house regrets the use, then probably the motion is asking you to evaluate up to this point, from the past and up to this point, how private military companies have been used, and whether we regret that or not would be the question in the debate. That concludes the part about different types of motion and their approaches.